Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So this is our fifth meeting with Opticos. And there we go. So I don't think I need to do a formal roll call. I saw who was here, but today we're going to just give you a quick overview of the project timeline. We're going to go over some of the questions we sent you, and we did get a couple of items, I think, from Richard Six asking for some clarifications and maybe others in this group. So we have a few slides on that. And then towards the end of the webinar, if anyone in the public wants to speak, we'll provide that opportunity. And really, we're not going to spend too much time on presentation, more just time for everyone to talk. We want you all to chime in. Let us know where you're at in your review, and now's a great time to ask for any clarifications. So the timeline is I had down to have your comments in by December 16th on this admin draft. Looking at a calendar today, I realized I can give you a little bit more time if you would like, because I'm out all next week. And then the office is only open 3 days after that. And so I'm not going to have time to go through everyone's comments in those 3 days. So if you want to take until January 2nd to fill out that spreadsheet I gave you, or send me your comments, that's perfectly fine with me. So just want to make sure you all have enough time. Then the idea would be to take all those comments, but also go back to Historic Landmarks Commission and Architectural Board of Review to get a little bit more formal input from those review bodies first. We went and did a little introduction meeting with them right when the admin draft was released, but it wasn't a time to really talk about the document itself. So the plan is to go back and then give all the edits to Opticos to then turn into the next draft. And then we need to kind of keep moving along, get the revised draft prepared and go through the normal hearing process. The grant that we're working with does have an expiration date of 2023. I think we have to get our final invoices and things in by summer of 2023. So we want to keep moving along. As a reminder, we have this Google Doc spreadsheet to submit your comments on. If you're finding that troublesome or you just don't want to use it, don't worry about it. Go ahead and send your comments to me. You can write them up in a Word document. You can email me. However you want to get those comments into me will work. And then oh, yes. Yeah.
When I send this to you, does it broadcast to everybody and everybody sees my obnoxiously long list?
Well, the idea was for this spreadsheet is that just the work group has access to it and staff, and you can all see each other's comments, because that way you can kind of get an idea of what each other is thinking. So yes, it does go to everyone, but okay. Don't worry about it. We like your long comments.
Okay.
I mean, now's your chance. We want to make this document one that's going to work for us and for developers and for the citizens. So
Rosie,
yeah,
on that line, so I sent in a summary of some of the discussions that Dedi and I had, but I just sent them this morning. Will those get published too, so that people can see them in that form? Or
I could that was in an email, I believe, right? Yeah, not a separate. Yeah, I could just forward the email to the rest of the work group.
That would be fine.
Okay, maybe I'll make a note of that.
Okay, thank you.
Forward email. Yeah, I just got it. I've been really busy this morning, so I haven't had time to look at it. Right. But anyone else have questions about the Rosie, commenting?
Rosie,
yeah, Richard.
I sent you a similar email.
You did, yeah. So I'll make sure I share those emails as well. Okay. So everyone kind of is on the same page. Okay.
I'm sorry, would it behoove the process for me to take some of those email comments and insert them into this spreadsheet?
If it's not too troublesome for you, that would be helpful. The reason the spreadsheet is helpful is not just that you can see each other's comments, but also Opticos set this up for us. So you'll see on the side, there's a
Yeah.
place where we can put the response in and then what the action is. So that way we can really track everything. So it is preferable that the
Will
comments
do.
go in the spreadsheet.
Will do.
Okay.
Yeah. But I guess I was thinking in conversation with Cass as well that a lot of our concerns or comments are kind of more global about the
Yes.
overall approach
Yeah.
and principles and everything and purpose of the document. So, but I do see the value of the spreadsheet too as an opportunity to get more specific on different sections, et cetera.
Yeah, if it's a
So, I
very
think that's good.
global comment, I think you're right. It's probably more appropriate in like the email format you sent, and it's something we can talk about as a group. But
Yeah.
yeah, this is set up to be kind of like very specific about what page you're talking about, what section. And it's also a way for us, we're going through this process as staff as well. We have our own spreadsheet and we'll kind of be able to compare them. Some of the comments are just going to be typos and things like that we can just get taken care of quickly. Others are going to take, we might have to compare, what did the work group say? What does staff think? What should we tell Opticos, after weighing those two things? Maybe they're not, if there's areas that we find maybe we're not in agreement, we'll have to talk some of those through too.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments about the process? Okay. So I think I'll turn this over now to Tony and of Opticos, because there were a couple of clarifications that were brought up, and he can go over in more detail these clarifications.
Thanks, Rosie. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Richard. I noticed, we noticed your comments mostly in the sheet. Thank you to everyone that filled it out so far and put your comments down. But thank you, Richard, for basically going through every page, it looks like. So thanks for reading it in such detail.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it's going to help. It's going to help.
I'm glad I'm retired.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's very helpful. Let's go with probably the simplest first here of these four things on the slide, the subterranean parking. Yeah, so we will clarify that. I'm sorry that this document doesn't do that, but yeah, the understanding is that subterranean parking does not have to comply with the setbacks for above grade parking. So it's basically to the property lines or however, the building code lets you do it. But yeah, you don't have to comply with the above grade parking requirements.
Tony, will there be separate or additional requirements for the amount of openings, this opacity of the openings, location of the entries, all that kind of stuff that we labor over when we do have one of these projects. Especially what I'm talking about when we have parking on ground floor within the building envelope. There's a lot of hoopla about how that looks from the street. You look in, and how wide open is the opening, and do you see the pipes, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So right now, Richard, the proposal is in the standards to only deal with parking at grade level behind habitable space.
Yeah.
So you have to have habitable space in front of it, and on side streets and on front streets, or if the parking at grade is facing some public space. Otherwise, you don't have to put habitable space or any other technique in front of it.
Well, let me jump in for an over this relates to overall question. If I'm a developer that wants to put ground floor parking within my building envelope up against the front or secondary front, do I then, because there's nothing addressing it, does it go to design review then?
No, it is addressed. It's in the standards. I can just pull the document up and show you if you'd like. Would
Oh, I'm
that,
sorry, no, that's okay.
would that help?
I don't, okay,
I mean, I can show you on the page, or I could just tell you that in the zone standards for each of the zoning districts, there's a column with building form, and about midway down the column, if it refers to the diagram above, and the diagram above is talking about the depth of space at the ground floor. And that, in combination with the parking setback on front and side streets, identifies that habitable space has to be between the building and the parking on front and side streets. And down side streets, after a certain distance away from the front, then you can put the parking as close to the property line as allowed.
yeah, so we have, I'm sorry, but I don't want to belabor this, but we do have projects, for instance, very down State Street, several projects have parking on the ground floor right against the front property line with
Yeah.
no habitable space in between. So if somebody proposes that, then that's breaking the standard and therefore has to go to design review.
Well, the way I understand it, it wouldn't comply with the standard, and the applicant at that point has a choice of electing to go to design review or realizing that they have a project that isn't in compliance with the standards. And
Got it.
so
Okay,
unless you all change the standards to say what you're saying right now, that they don't operate that way.
okay, I got it.
So let me 1 second, Cass, let me just dig into that, Richard. So are we hearing from this group and maybe the broader group of you that parking, I know what you're talking about. I was in a garage. I went up to Santa Barbara last week, and I was at Ortega and Anacapa in that garage. And that side street garage, I think, is pretty close to the sidewalk. And there isn't any habitable space between the garage itself and the back of the sidewalk. Is that a condition that we should be allowing?
No, I think in this, and this speaks to the document more generally, that I would like to see it. I would like to see those types of exceptions when used, not in conformance with the standards, and then it goes to design review. And so the more,
I see.
yeah, so
So you're,
I would rather not include it. And if somebody wants to challenge it and say, well, I want my parking up front or whatever, I'm out of the game and I have to go to discretionary.
okay, so I thank you for clarifying, Richard.
But I don't know whether that's the intent, Rosie, if that's the intent, just how strict do we get with it?
Yeah.
And how often do we require people to developers to go to the design agencies?
Mhm.
So I'm a little confused there.
Yeah, let me try to clarify that, and hopefully this will make sense. This is our thinking right now, is that somebody comes in and they have a project that meets what's in the design standards, including the parking standards Tony was just talking about.
Mhm.
Well and good, they conform, we can check it off. It goes to one hearing before a design review body, because that's in our city charter, that the ABR and HLC sees all these projects, but they confirm that the project meets the design standards and they're good to go. But if they want to do a parking location that doesn't fit in this, or is not part of this design standards, it's in the front, or any other kind of different arrangement, then they would go to regular design review like they do now.
Okay, and that's.
Yeah. That's the intent. So the idea is you meet these standards. It should be fairly, once we get used to using them and people understand how to use them, fairly easy process to sort of design your building to meet the standards if that's what you want, the quicker process, or you want something different, you go to design review.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, Cass, yeah.
Yeah, I know you're trying to do these clarifications right now, so I apologize, but I wonder, we had a rather robust discussion, Debbie and I and some of the other architects yesterday at our meeting. And I wonder if it certainly would be helpful to me if we could maybe kind of step back and look at the very big picture of this thing. I worry that we get down into, the weeds of it, and that, we have some, I think some pretty important comments about just the whole big thing about how this is really going to work and how we hope it will work. So I wonder if we could do that. And one of my very first questions to be clarified is that is the intention of this document would include the entire city, including the EPV, and that the because we have Main Street Large is listed and detailed with references to adjacent designated historic landmarks. So how does this document relate to the current objective design standards in the Spanish colonial revival style that we all created and were adopted? And that was actually the impetus for this work that we are doing now, to include a broader range of architectural styles. So that is just sort of one big question that I think would be helpful to understand.
Yeah, I can start with that, and Tony, feel free to chime in. So the intent is that these standards would be available pretty much anywhere in the city that allows multi-unit housing, including within EPV. And we provided our adopted objective design standards for Senate Bill 35 to Opticos at the beginning of this process. And I can tell by reading it, there's places where they basically took what was adopted in that document and folded it in, especially into the section that talks about the Spanish revival style buildings and the Mediterranean style buildings. So there'll be a point where we need to sort of look at what we adopted for Senate Bill 35 and decide if this sort of supersedes that. And I think this is where we're going, is that if a project does come in under Senate Bill 35, they would use this instead of that previously adopted document. Senate Bill 35 does expire. I can't remember exactly when. So whether or not the state continues it, I don't know. So there's a possibility that particular streamlining provision will go away anyway. But in any case, the intent was this would apply an EPV and would replace that previous document. But a lot of it, if not all of it, has been incorporated into this. And I don't know if you want to add anything, Tony.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you. So
Do you have any other big picture?
yes.
If that's okay with everyone before we get into the details. Yeah.
Well, maybe I'll just kind of start with one thing. And that was, so I got the thing printed out. So I've got the document here. And first of all, thank you. Thank you for this work. Not easy. One of the things I guess key in my mind, besides sort of running through like how this would work, just kind of doing a typical scenario. One was about the types of architecture versus the styles of the architecture. And in my mind, and maybe you can confirm this, that all of the architectural types can be designed in any of the styles, given our current height limits. So you could have any one of the styles, we have like 5 styles or something like that, right? They could all apply to any of the types, whether you had a, you know, carriage house could be contemporary, or it could be, you know, Spanish,
That's
either
correct.
one. So that's true. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay, so I think if we could make that more clear, that would help, that these are types, and that they can be, and so I think all the types, and this is something Debbie and I did talk about, that each one of those types should have a photograph, a really great photograph of a Santa Barbara building that exemplifies that, all the styles. So instead of a type just showing a craftsman style, it should have one of each style, so that people looking at it can get the idea that, oh yeah, we can do a fourplex in any one of these styles that we want. And then conversely, the same thing, the styles should include examples of all the types from our Santa Barbara inventory, from some great examples that we have in Santa Barbara. So that was one thing that we felt was really would be helpful to understand the differences between the types and the styles.
Can I interrupt and with a suggestion to
Please
that?
do, absolutely, yes.
Um,
Conversation, yes.
One of the things, I understand where you're going with this. One of the things that I liked about the document was the quick code guide. And I wonder if in fact, Cass, what you're asking for, a way to make clear to any applicant the variety of decisions possible within the ODS. If a quick code guide, which they've already started, could be developed to do that, so that we weren't multiplying the pages that are already in a lengthy document.
Correct, yeah,
Just a
exactly.
suggestion.
Right, so if somebody's doing a project, their very first question is, what zone am I in? And what are the what are the overlays of that zone? What are my options given the zoning? Because this document will say you can do any style you want in any of these locations, but in these locations, you can only do this. So then you know your options given the zone. Then you select the one you like. You select a type, and then you select a style, and then you design it, and then you go through ministerial review, and then you're done. Basically.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in here real quick. So, some of what you're talking about are things we've been thinking about as staff as well. And I did want to ask a point of clarification from Tony, because I thought I saw on one of the styles, and it could have been the cottage style, that there was a mention that this style is not suitable for the largest building type. Am I correct in that?
I'm going to ask Stefan to respond to that, please.
Rosie, I want to make sure that I understand the question. I'm sorry. Can you
Yeah.
repeat?
Yeah, I can repeat that. So one of the questions asked, I believe it was Cass, she said, are all the building styles available to be used on all the different building types? So we have the 3 main styles, 6 sub styles. And I thought I saw somewhere it was craftsman or cottage. It said that's not applicable to like a Main Street building. Am I correct in that? Or
I
maybe
think
there's
that's-
others.
I think that's correct. Yes, that's the only, I believe that's the only sort of restriction on style application.
And that kind of makes sense. You don't, especially the cottage style on a,
That's correct.
Four-story
Yeah.
cottage doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah.
and I will say that too, that, just to sort of clarify that there was some previous discussion with staff about honing in on certain styles geographically. But that what this is presenting is more general in its application of styles.
Yes, I wanted to mention, if we're talking about big picture things, we have that map that sort of discusses within EPV, you're limited to the Spanish Mediterranean style group. Everywhere else is anything goes, but that's very much open for your input, for staff's input, and also from the community's input. If there are other areas of the city where we want to say limit contemporary only to certain areas of the city, or any other choices like that, is still very wide open.
Well, that will be brought out by the map, correct?
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay. And I like Dennis's idea that maybe this exception for the large type, craftsman not appropriate to large types, be a exception in the quick code review guide.
So it sounds like, and we also talked about the quick code guide. We want to sort of make the quick code guide a little more, that's at the very beginning of the document, a little more comprehensive. So that's the first thing anyone looks at and sort of figures out how they need to work through the process. Is that sort of what I'm hearing from the work group,
Mhm.
and what their choices are?
Right. And that was basically, I just regurgitated what's basically here. So that is the process, right?
Yeah.
So okay, so here's something, and I don't know, Debbie, maybe you want to talk about this, because I don't, we went into looking at the types. So if you go to the types, let's go to the types.
Yeah, I think what we were.
Debbie, do you
Yeah,
want to
I'll
talk
go
about
ahead
that?
and let me just start on it at least. And
Sure.
then let's see where it leads. But I think stepping back as we're doing, trying to get to sort of fundamental principles, it is overwhelming to have a document like this that's 301 pages. There is so much detail in here, and so much that's very, very prescriptive, I should say. When you consider the variety of lots and development options and all the different ways in which development is done, I can see that some of the examples just don't really even make sense in Santa Barbara, as witnessed by the actual developments that we have in some of these lots where we have long, narrow lots, et cetera, that type of thing. And so as we were going through this, we're looking at the building types and kind of felt that it could be greatly simplified. There's a description of the building type, of what it is, what constitutes that particular building type. And then there are photographs that show how that building type would be developed in the different styles that would be allowed for that particular building type. And in some cases, as we just said, certain styles might not be appropriate, and that would be a part of that. So you don't really need all the prescriptive descriptions of end gable and side gable and maximum dimensions and all of these things. Those are things that in many ways are already covered in our zoning ordinance with respect to setbacks and things like that. The photos themselves, the style definition will cover all those things. They will cover what are the features of that particular style. And that can be handled in a relatively small series of pages that pertain to the distinctive styles. And that's where you can talk about gables and porches and I don't know about dimensions necessarily. Again, I think that's probably overkill. The end result being that somebody is developing a lot, they pick a building type as described in that section. They can see how these building types have been developed in the past, etc. You don't need a whole lot of additional description in there. Maybe a few things need to be noted in addition to just that information. Then you go to the style that you're going to pursue for the development that fits that building type on a particular lot. And in that style description, I'm sure you've all seen these books on styles where you have some maybe drawn examples, and then just what are the features of that style? What are the distinctive elements of that style, and how are they done without getting into an overwhelming amount of detail that really constrains any kind of creativity or unique circumstances of a particular lot or an expression that might be appropriate but doesn't fit into the exact dimensional parameters that are listed in the in the document as it stands now. So that was kind of our feeling, like, hey, you could probably cut this thing back to 100 pages or something, and then organize it in such a way that you can easily access what you need, rather than being jumping all over the map to try and figure out what you can do in your particular lot. That was kind of the feeling, and we're just looking at it as people who haven't been involved in developing this document. We're trying to understand it. And from my perspective, and I think Cass as well, okay, we have a lot, what do you have to do to make use of this document? What do you have to go through? And you may end up saying, you know what, it's just too much. I'm just going to go to ABR like we used to go, because it'll be easier than trying to navigate this document. So that's kind of where we were coming from, that could it be, dramatically simplified and still get the same result, basically?
If I
You
could,
always have.
can I just add to what Debbie was saying? Sorry, Debbie, did you finish what you were? Debbie? I didn't.
Well, I was just to finish the thought, you still have the checks and balances of the fact that, more as it stands now at least, ABR still has to, the design review board still has to go through the checklist and confirm that it's that the proposal conforms with the objective standards. And maybe that's just like on consent with a staff person, and they can always refer it back to the full board if it looks like it's just too far out of the parameters of the style as more loosely defined. So anyway, that.
Okay.
I just
And
wanted,
Cass-
I wanted to, if I could, just want to add to Debbie, I just want to, that we think this is a really great document and all of it is here. I just want to be sure that we're, underscoring that, and that in the area that you have under the styles, it's all very thoroughly there. So that's why we're saying under the types, we can maybe not have so much stuff because we refer it over to here. And then we only include, also thinking kind of, well, what's the worst case scenario that something could happen? If you're saying you're doing Craftsman, it's very clearly, you can be sure that in the notation, you say that it's generally characterized by these size members or something that catches that. But if they're, what I'm saying? So without getting into more, maybe there's a way of just kind of simplifying this down to allow more to not be quite so, if they're, I don't know what to say, but just to simplify it and not have it at the types as well.
Okay. And I see John and Dennis had their hands up, so I'll let John go first and then Dennis.
Well, I would respectively disagree with both of those comments. I think the document needs to be as prescriptive as possible and leave anybody that, because you're asking for somebody to go through an administrative process. And so to have staff have the basis to make decisions on, it should be as prescriptive as possible. And if somebody doesn't want to do what's in the objective design, they can always opt to go for the design review process. It's my experience dealing with architects and builders throughout the state. They need the guidance because most of them, plain simple, I mean, you get a lot of talent here, but not all architects are that talented and don't quite get some of the style. So I would suggest you be as prescriptive as possible to make it as administrative as possible. And if somebody wants to do something different, kick them into design review. That's the whole intent of the legislation in the first place. Thank you.
Okay, and Dennis?
I'll echo some of those comments. And I put some of these comments in the Google spreadsheet, some of my comments. I was a little intimidated at first by the 300-page document, but I quickly realized it's actually already fairly simple. You ask the question, where do you want to build? And you ask the question, what do I want to build? Do I want to build a single family house? Do I want to build an apartment building? Do I want to build a big mixed use building?
Hello.
Once you've asked those two questions, you have zoomed into those relevant sections of the document, and you don't have to deal with 300 pages. If you ask those two questions, you're already down to 100 pages. It's already simplified, and the quick code guide would even help that some more. So I'm not concerned about that. I also think that the whole point of objective design standards is to reduce as much as possible design discretion and design review. I cannot imagine a process where something goes to consent and consent then sends it to the full board. That's not going to happen if somebody is checking boxes under an ODDS. So I think it needs to be as prescriptive as possible. I also think the way the document is organized, you ask a question about where do you want to build, you ask a question about type, you then think about the form of your building, and the fourth step is to style. And each of those are discrete and clearly laid out in the document. So I think that it needs to be and can be very prescriptive. I do have one question, and I'm interested to hear Opticus talk about this based on their experience in other jurisdictions. I quite like the graphic layout of the document and the use of images. And we've talked already in some of these comments about adding more images. What happens if a developer uses this document and claims that it's not specific, that the images are different than text? Lawyers like things written down. They like things very specific in words. And if you start to say there's a graphic explanation, you look at this picture, not a diagram, not a drawing that's labeled, but you look at this picture. Well, that opens, I'm curious if Opticus has encountered issues with the legal challenges to instructions that are too visual.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. On that question, what we've learned is if you're going to use a photograph, you have to direct the reader to what you're showing in that photograph. Otherwise, you notice the photographs that we use tend to say illustrative only, because unless we're calling something out in that photograph or in a diagram, it's too vague. So you have to call it out or say it's illustrative for the very reasons you just stated.
And I just want to give a quick reminder, if you're not speaking, if you could mute yourself and then unmute to speak. Richard, did you have your hand up? Okay.
Just to add, if the building types contain a lot of dimensions, form relationships, and all that dimensionality that's there would be lost, and that's the objectiveness would go. So I would again resonate with the last couple of speakers about radically reducing the building types, because there's where all the dimensions and relationships are.
If I could offer, I just wanted to dig into that a little bit. We've written codes without building types. The last one we did was a year and a half ago in San Rafael. It doesn't have a building type in it. However, those codes where we don't use building types tend to be where the buildings are all attached or primarily attached, and the concern is about the ground floor and height. And where buildings can be detached and where there's separation is expected, and those kinds of relationship between buildings, we found that controlling the footprint through building types is the clearest way. Can they be aggregated into groups? Like, do you need to say duplex? And fourplex? Can you just say, certainly. But we found that they're really necessary at the lower intensity end of the spectrum, where buildings are smaller and detached, and not as necessary on the upper end of the spectrum. So just FYI.
Okay, Dedi. Oh, you need to unmute.
You're muted.
So, if you then drill down a little bit more to the actual exhibits that you've created for each of the building types, I noticed, for example, that you use an image of a building with gable end, and then you refer to a left, or I should say side gable, etc. But you don't have any illustrations for a hip roof, for example, or a flat roof. or a combination of those kinds of roofs. So it feels like you're missing, you have to add more, of those kinds of illustrations if you wanted to cover all the possibilities under in one of the certain of the building types where you use those. And then there's another example of something where it could be confusing. You have illustrations for a building type that's a townhouse, and admirably you show it with a number of units along a street frontage with little entry doors right on the street, which is great if that's possible. But if you look around Santa Barbara, there have been a lot of developments of townhomes of that nature, attached 2-story, 2 or 3-story townhomes, but almost all of them are developed on narrow, deep lots where the entry doors and the building itself is perpendicular to the street. There are very, very few opportunities where you could ever do a series of townhomes fronting the street. So I'm not saying that that's not possible and even desirable if it is possible, but it doesn't take into account the reality. So that would be more in the area of a specific comment on a specific exhibit that you have in there that probably needs to be expanded. But it's an example of how it could be confusing when you just show gable-ended buildings and that's the building type. And then you get into the style and you don't want to do gable, you want to do a hip roof, or you want to do a combination, maybe some portion of a flat roof or something like that. So.
Yeah, I will mention too, just from what I've heard from staff, it is a little confusing for them and a little hard to envision some of this working in our really odd shaped lots, because the illustrations show some very nice, rectangular lots, which we can achieve sometimes when people combine, do lot mergers. But again, we do have a lot of long, skinny lots or triangle shaped lots and things like that. And I think, I don't know if your experience working with other jurisdictions, you've found that's been confusing for people or a little harder to understand how you apply these when your lot is odd shape. I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, Rosie, the reason that the diagrams show rectangular lots is that the section in the back, exceptions, is meant to deal with the oddities, with the abnormalities in lots, and that's why we don't build that into the diagrams that you see everywhere else. That's the short answer.
Okay, and do you think, and when Deddy was speaking about the townhouses on the long skinny lots, it kind of sparked in my head, oh, he's right. I've seen that over and over again in our town. And would that be covered in the exceptions section where someone could?
No, it's something that we were just talking about that the other day for another reason. And we were looking at 1021 Laguna, which I've seen, maybe one of you all designed it. It's on the west side of Laguna, and it's got a 1-story volume at the street, and then it goes to 2 and then back to 1, and then there's a building. Oh, you did that building. Okay. Yeah, it's a nice project. And we were looking at the public realm, how the public realm extended from the street into that project and to the back. And it's beautiful in the way that the edge of the property line, the north property line, was designed, and the way the entries were brought and made prominent. We were looking at it because more and more we're being asked to code for what a lot of the US is calling slot homes. Now, that's not a slot home, but by another architect and in another city without good standards and review, they're getting slot homes in that same configuration. So we were looking at how to code for that and what lessons could we learn from that project specifically. So that is probably a type that we need to include here.
Okay, Deddy, do you have your hand raised again, or is it just still up from before? Oh, you're muted.
Jump back and forth here. It's very quiet in my office, so I probably don't need to mute, but Yeah, the other question is, and it refers back to something that Rosie said, you know, we have all these examples of lots and then the building types, you know, illustrated within those lots. But there are no dimensions on the lot. So we don't know if they're, you know, just, well, they are strictly hypothetical, but then you get very specific that the maximum width of a certain type of building can only be 40 feet or 31 feet or whatever in that particular building type. And that seems to me kind of unrealistic as well, because we don't necessarily have lots that are shaped in the way that those lots are illustrated. And we don't really know what the dimension of the lots is. And it may require the architect to design a building that doesn't necessarily conform to the prescribed dimension, but still conforms in every other way to the design style and all of the other things that we're trying to objectify. So I just question that, because right away I can see, oh, well, I wouldn't work on this lot because you have to design something that's going to be a little bit different than the prescribed dimensions, but still be a great project. And Laguna Court, the one that you mentioned, is probably a good example of that. There was no prescription on the exact dimensions of units. We had to come up with a way to make the project work within the context of that particular unusual lot.
Yeah, I mean, all I can say is we'll take another look at what we've done, but the idea is that, and not to say that we've missed something, because that's part of what an admin draft is all about. We're trying to get close on the first draft and see where things need to be tightened up or added. But the idea, our approach to lot size is, well, let me tell you where we're coming from. Is we see a lot of codes say that something is allowed, and when you try it out, it isn't. Or, you know, the building is too big, or it's too small, and nobody would do a small building on a lot that wide. So what we've tried to do is say these building types are coordinated to these lot widths, because we know that that's the minimum lot width to make that building function. If you want to use more lot width, you can, but we know the minimum is X. And that's where we're coming from, is trying to bridge that gap of either not putting too little and not putting too much on that lot. If that's sort of, yeah, I don't know, I think I'm being clear, but if I'm not, let me know.
No, it makes sense.
Cass, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess I don't disagree with anything that anybody has said here. We're having a discussion and trying to find, you know, we're trying to find answers and how we can do this in the most efficient way. That's the whole purpose of this discussion, I think. So what just back on this idea of the types, you know, we have our zoning. Our zoning establishes what all the setbacks are, what the heights are. All of that is already established, is it correct? So that's where I'm wondering why is it wise to reproduce that here? Because if you are you're saying, okay, well, I have this lot over here, I'm in this zone, you go do your homework and you figure out what all of that's, you know, all the setback, everything else, you figure that out going to the ordinance. And then you say, okay, well, based on this, I could do a fourplex is probably the best shot for this particular project. And then you would pick one, right? Or maybe it's you know, one of the others, but you'd pick the one that made the most sense given the constraint. And then you would go to the styles, and then the styles you've gone into great detail on these styles. So there it is, right? There it all is. You can go to the style, and then you can say, all right, I'm doing this style. And then you go off and do your design based on all this very detailed information that is in here. That's the point, I think, that we're trying to make, is that would be a way of simplifying the document, I believe.
So if I hear you right, maybe let me know if I'm misunderstanding you. You're talking about trying to migrate the building type information is only what's necessary in the building type information into the style chapter. Is that right? No. Okay, I'm misunderstanding.
No, that's not. I'm saying you still can have this group, this particular section, definitely. And you'd have all of these different types. I do wonder about, clearly carriage house, duplex, fourplex, multiplex, those are all types. I'm not sure about cottage court, neighborhood court, pocket neighborhood. Seems more like an arrangement that could have, any particular type. Anyone, you could have, 6 contemporary structures. It doesn't have to be a traditional, but it's a layout. So that confuses me a little bit. But anyway, so you keep the types like pretty much like you have it, but you could, just as Deddy was saying, he read, you have this description that just describes the general nature of the characteristics of the type and the number of units, and then any other caveats or whatever else you want to say about it. And then you have 5 pictures that show that particular style in
Type.
all of the different types. So you'd have a contemporary, you'd have a mid-century, or not mid-century, you'd have craftsman, you'd have a good example of each one of the styles within that type. That's all we're saying. It's just, there you go. You can kind of get an idea of what that would be like, depending. You say, oh, I'm going to do this style. And then you go to the style where you really get into the weeds. So it's just a way of kind of merging things together, but still achieving all the necessary detail that was mentioned by others here. That's all.
Yeah, I can see that.
Okay, and Dennis, did you want to chime in? You're still muted, Dennis.
I think I'm following some of this, which is still this quest for simplification. And one issue that I think I'm hearing being raised is, do we need to duplicate in the ODDS items that might be already covered in existing zoning codes, right? And my question goes back to a legal question, and we're not going to be able to answer it now, but I think it needs to be answered at some point. Is it better to avoid, is it better to have everything spelled out in the ODS instead of saying, well, you go to chapter 25 for some of this, and then you go to chapter 30 for some things? I think I don't know whether that's a wise approach from a legal point of view. Do you want everything spelled out, even if it means there is some duplication between ODDS and existing zoning codes? It's just a question for down the road.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And we've talked about that a good deal as staff as well. Because there are, almost every project has to go to more than one code, because we do have certain things in different parts of our Muni code. Not everything you want to know about a building is not necessarily all in Title 30, for example, in the zoning ordinance. There's other places in the code you have to go to. And we've noticed there are some things in this new Title 25. We thought, no, we probably don't have to repeat that. It's already in Title 30. For example, the solar access height limitation section. And we have talked a lot about this as staff, like where do you don't want, it's kind of preferable for somebody to be able to find most of what they want in this one title when they're going to be using objective design standards. There is a whole section in the beginning. It's rather long. It's table 250104A, and it talks about what's in Title 30 versus what's in this, and what applies and what doesn't apply. So that's kind of where you go to find out which title you're using for certain things. But we have talked a lot about simplifying that table as well and making it very, very clear. So it's an ongoing conversation. We don't have the full answer. I think legally it probably doesn't matter that you have to go to different parts of the code, because every project has that issue, but it's a good food for thought, and something, we're kind of also gearing towards maybe making this a little less not such a big document, a little easier to go through, and ways we can make that happen from the get-go.
I got a thought on that. What would really be cool, I think, is if you could create an app where the first part of the app, you answer the question of what kind of lot, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. And then once you have all those questions answered, all of the sections that apply pop up, and then you have exactly what you need. You don't have to dig through a huge
That's awesome.
document.
We need a software engineer.
You know what?
John, you
It
had,
only costs a few.
or Tony, did you want to say something? And then John had his hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what Debbie's saying. Yeah, so we have a partner, they're in Miami, and we talked to them a lot about writing that very thing. Their name is Gridix. The company's name is Gridix, and they provide online portals for codes. And they work primarily with codes like this that are clear form-based codes, because there are a lot of form-based codes out there, but they work with codes like this that they put all this information into a giant table behind the scenes. And then the interface is super simple. It's I don't know, I think they charge like $65,000, $75,000 to do that, to do what you just said. Yeah. So for bigger citywide projects, we actually include that as an item for the client to do. So
Thanks. And John?
Yeah, I just wanted to pass on my experience with implementing form-based codes in going through litigation processes with national merchant builders over form-based codes. If you can specifically state, and you should, because this becomes the point of litigation, what in your form-based code is going to stand by itself, and if it's not addressed, what's not addressed is subject to whatever's in the zoning ordinance. And if you don't make that very, very clear, this could be a real rat's nest. So I've gone through this a couple times, and I would suggest that we make sure if there's something we want to defer to the zoning ordinance, we say so. Like the solar is a perfect example, but we need to make it very, very clear that we don't leave ambiguities out there, because the worst case is you've got two sets of standards and people are arguing what applies, and the lawyers love to make hay of this kind of stuff. So just putting that out there.
Yeah, another point that was brought up is sometimes codes are updated. So you don't want to put too much where you have to update multiple places as well. Like if the solar access height standard was updated, we don't want to have to do it in two places. Cass?
Yeah, we're very sensitive to this particular issue because, as architects, that's our number one thing we learn in school, is to put it in one place and one place only, so that when anything changes, organize stuff together and put it in one place. So if it ever changes, you go to one place to change it and you don't worry that you have. So we're very sensitive to that. And it's kind of, it's just interesting. This whole is like a big plan check correction. So, we feel the pain equally, but yeah, that's a really important issue. That's so key, right?
Yeah. Stefan, do you have your hand raised? Did you want to say something?
Yeah, thanks, Rosie. Just in addition to the table, Rosie, that you referenced that describes the relationship between the information here and the rest of Title 30, I think another sort of important thing to indicate is the applicability section, which follows on page 16. And there's a table there that basically describes when this code applies. And from the user standpoint, sort of our goal there is to be able to say, if you are doing an applicable project, that you can basically take this title, and as Rosie said, for the most part, everything that you need that's guiding zoning standards for your project will be found in this document. And then there won't be a need to actually sort of go back and forth between the zoning ordinance and this document to understand what applies to your project. And so that just wanted to kind of summarize that for everybody, that that's the intent here, is from a user standpoint, is to eliminate, once you know what the project is that you're doing, to eliminate the need to go back and forth.
Okay. So I know we had some kind of more clarifications and some specific things we wanted to talk to the group about, but I think this big picture discussion is very, very good and gives there's a lot to think about on organizing and perhaps simplifying, perhaps not. We'll kind of see how that falls out. I'd like to give, like, Tony and Stefan, do you have anything else you want to add, or does anyone else want to talk about a big picture item, or should we kind of dive back into a little more details? Cass?
Yeah, just real quick. You mentioned it in this document about the signage part, you know, because we have a sign ordinance and all that. And so that's just a question, is that, do we really need that section since it's covered elsewhere? You reference that. And then the other part I would like to understand more is the civic, you know, the public spaces, the civic areas. And then one other suggestion, and we talked about this yesterday at our meeting, Rosie, that you and Dan were at, is that, you know, you have and Stefan just referred to that a little bit too, is that, you know, a short executive summary at the very beginning would be really helpful, I think, just to kind of give, you know, put it in a nice little package of what this is about, you know, the purpose of it. And I think you have that language already in other areas that you could just pull from that and maybe put it at the very front. So this be really clear as can be about what the purpose of this is.
Okay, and I think going back to your questions, chapter 9, the signage chapter, so that's part of the package that Opticos gave us. It's not something we envisioned having in the first place, but because they had sign standards, and as a city, we are in the process of updating our sign ordinance and could use perhaps those illustrations and those designs in the future. We thought may as well include it. I think the idea is to eventually perhaps pull it out as a separate document and sort of move that forward with updates to the sign ordinance on a separate track. The civic spaces chapter, was there something specific you wanted to ask about in a big picture way on that one before we move on, Cass?
I guess I'll just say, you know, my understanding is that we are trying to create objective design standards for expanded styles of architecture. And we have zoning ordinances that, you know, require all kinds of things. So I guess that, you know, set the size, bulk, and scale of the project. So I'm just trying to understand how then how we sort of move into this area of civic spaces with regard to this, with regard to creating housing. I didn't say that very well, but anyway, I'm just trying to connect those two things and how a control of this area is relevant.
Okay, I can start and then Tony or Stefan can chime in. I think, and I could be wrong, but I think the intent, you know, when we did the Senate Bill 35 standards and we looked a lot at EPV, and we had a section on what's important within EPV were the paseos, courtyards, arcades, and things like that. And so we sort of created standards for those things in case we got a project coming in that needed the objective design standards for those spaces. And I think that kind of morphed a little bit into the civic space. And then that, my understanding is from Opticos, is they have created these civic space standards for other jurisdictions, and they tend to apply to very large lots, which we may not have many of. And so these standards may not come into play for most of our projects, but I don't know if you want to chime in a little bit more, Tony or Stefan.
Tony, I can jump in. So right now in the draft, there is a threshold, and it actually is sort of based on the development site width. And so what the idea is, if you're doing sort of a typical infill project, there's no sort of civic space requirement. Once you're doing sort of a larger parcel, so you can imagine like something that might be like a half block in size or something like that, the idea is that you would set aside 10% of the design site as civic space, and it would be it would use this section of the code to establish the design parameters for that civic space. And there's no requirement that this actually becomes public space. It's not an exaction, but it is basically a requirement to make something akin to publicly accessible spaces on the design site. So so this section is sort of providing guidance for that. And Tony, maybe you can talk about, because this is another place where we actually can use some input on sort of what's appropriate here.
Yeah, no, that's it, Stefan. That right now it's currently written as if it's a parcel that does not go through from one street to the other, full block width, 150 feet is the threshold. If it does go from one lot to the one side of this block to the other, 200 feet is the threshold. And we need input on whether you think that requirement is correct and relevant to you, and B, if it is, are those thresholds where they need to be?
John, do you have your hand raised? Or you're muted still?
Yeah, I had another global thing in which I wanted to bring up, which was based on a conversation I had with a fellow commissioner, Commissioner Lodge, which I don't see being addressed, and I'm not sure if it's intentional or maybe it's just something we should think about. She raised an issue that she's seen in lots of projects over the last few years, especially the larger ones that we would have in the neighborhood large and the Main Street large, of having units which don't have a whole lot of light and air. And I wasn't sure where that might be addressed, or should we have some kind of standards of minimum light and air for especially bedrooms? We don't want to start creating dormzilla type situations just inadvertently with this form-based code. So I'm passing that on as something she raised, which I think is a good point. Now, whether this is the right place for it or not, I couldn't tell you.
John,
Tony, do you have an answer to that, or should we just take it as a comment and?
Yeah, it's a question that we need to look into. John, do you have an example that you can point us to of what the commissioner and you were trying to?
Yeah, I'll send those to you, Tony, because she has some very specific examples that have happened fairly recently.
Okay.
So.
We know there's, minimum building code standards, but it sounds like you're talking about going beyond building code. Yeah. I want to do it just a real quick. It's 2:10. So just a quick time check in. I do have to end this right at 2:30. And I want to spend just a couple minutes at the end talking about next steps and whether we want to meet again and that kind of thing. So we can go ahead and have this conversation for another 10-15 minutes or so, but and then we'll kind of check in. Dennis, did you have something?
A very quick comment. I see issues of solar access, let's call it that, light into a depth of a building will become an increasingly contentious issue as we go forward. The thrust of a lot of the pressure on housing is to densify downtown by building 3- and 4-story buildings. I think one recent case would be 113, 117 West Delegata, which was before HLC in early November. And I'm not sure what the solution is, because in part, and I made this in the Google spreadsheet, I'm not sure what the current provisions in the code are to protect solar access. But I certainly see it coming up more and more in the future. Whether ODS is the appropriate place or not, I don't know. The other comment will be to go back to something that Tony was raising about thresholds and about civic space. I think that one, and I'm going to be chauvinist here, one of the things that makes Santa Barbara special is it has a very strong kind of urban DNA of paseos, arcades, and courtyards. And what I would like to see is an ODDS that figures out how to encode what we already have done well in this town. What the thresholds are, I'm very open to that. So that's just my comment there.
Rosie,
Yes.
if I may, on big picture, it was partly attached to my questions on facade zones and things. But ABR struggles with these large buildings, 4 stories high, with almost no articulation in the facades. And the way I read the facade zones and so forth, with a maximum that you could be set back into the facade zone, and a minimum that the facade has to be within linearly within the facade zone. It seems it's all backwards. it's like encouraging these developers to develop significant flat facades. And just my general comment is, it seems like we're not taking care of that problematic large scale flat planed building. You know, I think we need to have minimum articulations and ins and outs of these facades, and more mention about variation of roof forms, and more mention of, you know, at least X% of that flat facade has to have ins and outs, or architectural features, or windows, or interesting arrangements. And I don't, it just, you know, I haven't designed anything under this, but it seems that that's an area where we need a lot more help in getting those large facades to be more varied and manipulated and interesting.
Yeah,
Tony, do you want to, chime in?
yeah, I can respond to that. Thank you, Richard. Yeah, it's interesting that it is coming across that way to you. We're going to have to make that more clear, because it's actually the opposite. It's yeah. Sorry for that to come across that way, and we will look at that. But what the facade zone is, it's another term for a minimum to maximum setback on front and side street frontages. That's all it is. And the reason that we call it a facade zone is that minimum to maximum band, you know, for the minimum setback to the maximum setback, that band, which you see hatched in the diagrams, is where the facade can be minimum to maximum and still create the public realm for that particular zoning district. That's the idea. So that's one half of it. The reason that we don't use a build-to line instead of this is that a build-to line, it's just a minimum. It says you have to be there. And what we found over the years is that works for super intense environments where you really want all the frontages just at 1-0 setback or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
In other zones, we found that a little too inflexible. And so the facade zone works to provide a band that the architect can then say, oh, it's telling me 65% of my facade needs to be within this band, and the other 35% can be anywhere where I want. I can pull it all the way back to the property line, you know, near the rear if I wanted to, or somewhere toward the front. It's up to you. So it's meant to be more flexible than a build-to line, and it's meant to give creativity to the designer to place the facade as long as it's in compliance with those percentages.
Yeah, it just seemed like the minimums and the maximums were switched.
Reversed, yeah. We'll
Yeah.
take another look at it and try to make it more clear, but that's what it's trying to do.
All right, good. And it's just not the facade zone. It is, where is there mention? We talk about, in some of the smaller building types of the importance of bays.
Uh-huh.
And like in the large blocks, the bays are flexible. You don't need to have any bays. And what we find fighting with our applicants with flat facades is, hey, you need to push that bay or distinguish
Yeah.
a portion of the building as a bay, as different, and start pushing and pulling. So, that kind of thing concerns me. And do we have some tools that we can use to, at least get off of the blank white flat facade right at the building property on the main streets and the large neighborhoods and so forth. So just a general to think about.
Okay.
Okay, I'm wondering, in the time we have left, it looks like maybe 10 minutes or so. There were a couple of specific questions we sent to you ahead of time that we really wanted your work group input on. So we talked a little bit about styles now, but we did wonder if you had a chance to look at the rooftop decks section and had any particular comments on that. I can actually pull up a slide of that section, so I'll do that while you're thinking about it, or raise your hand if you want to weigh in on rooftop decks.
Well, Rosie, to summarize my written comments to you in email, I was surprised to see that the roof decks, at least described and graphically shown in the standards, were a lot more enclosed than I would think that they could be. So should be. So I'm thinking that there needs to be a clear definition of when a roof deck becomes a partial floor or a full floor. Does that enclosed roof deck become, can it be above the maximum heights of buildings? So it was a little unclear to me in that regard.
And did anyone else, I mean, you're the ones who get these projects and you work with your applicants for rooftop decks. Are there things that weren't covered in these standards that you would like to see, when you do review a rooftop deck and the guidance you give to the applicants? Is there anything that should be included?
Well, we constantly fight with applicants to get the roof deck away from, because they're so, the user of the roof deck is so free to move about and peer over the edge. A privacy issue with neighbors is constantly an issue. And I think the other thing is, as I said, it's just how enclosed can it be, and when it becomes a significant part of additional massing at the top. So
I mean, would you then, if it was enclosed, do you want the rooftop deck to be included in the maximum height? And I think Brenda's on here. She can probably correct me if I get it wrong, what is included in height and what isn't, but.
Yes, was that a question, Rosie?
I guess it was. You can clarify.
Solid roof would be included in the height, but like a trellis, or like what we're seeing in this picture, that sort of open trellis kind of thing, is not included in the height. So
the diagram in the standards anyway has a considerably opaque and significant roof in the diagram, in the image anyway. So I think that needs to be clarified and clarified.
Okay, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I see what you're saying. And I don't have that picture right in front of me, but I know what you mean.
Yeah, the picture that we're showing in the standards, and then the diagram, the intention is, sometimes we ask cities to, think a little differently about what they're regulating. In this one, we're asking you to not count it as another, well, to actually let it be closed to a certain extent, and let it not count toward the height, let it be an exception, in order to get the spaces.
Yeah, I would be concerned about that, so. But I'll,
Yeah, no, I'm sure there are concerns. I mean, but I'm just telling you where we're coming from. It's, we're also trying to shrink the footprint. You see the setbacks, which implies that smaller footprint buildings wouldn't have them, for the very reasons that, everybody says they don't want somebody looking over their neighbor. So that isn't stated, but it's implicit. You'd have to have a certain width building and depth building to actually achieve one of these spaces. And so that's a question to you all as well.
Is there anyone else that wants to weigh in on rooftop decks real quick? And I can't see everyone. If you raise your hand, you might have to tell me.
Rosie, I can let you know if somebody raises their hand.
Okay, thanks. I see Sheila Lodge raised her hand, and I'll give, we'll have a little bit of time for public comment at the end, so I'll address that in a minute or two. Okay, so I think we talked a bit about the standards. I think we'll have to revisit this question about if there's other areas of the city that should limit the styles allowed. If you have any thoughts on that, please send them or include them in your comments. Because that's something we did want to hear from you is, aside from EPV, what are other areas of the city should potentially consider limiting the number of styles or types, the styles that would be allowed?
Rosie,
yes.
just to understand the question, like the Brinkerhoff or the bungalow districts, those would be obvious places that we start with those exceptions of limiting styles, correct?
Yes.
Correct, yes.
Okay, thanks.
And some of those areas already have style limitations in our code. But I
Again,
believe there's.
So it gets to the further discussion about what's included and what isn't, and what's referenced out of this document to others.
Correct.
And Cass has her hand raised, Rosie.
Okay, Cass.
Just very quick. So how do we, wouldn't this be something that we need input from the community about what the community wants? I mean, for say, just as a wild example, what if contemporary and industrial was only allowed, say, in the funk zone? Just
right.
No,
I agree. This is something.
How do we know from the community what the community wants in these various areas?
Right. So we did do a survey, and I haven't closed it yet, so I don't know the results. So we'll take a look at that survey. And also this will, once it's in beyond the admin draft form and we've got a draft, we'll be going to public hearings, and we can definitely raise that and get community input at those venues as well. Okay, and I don't think we have time to really delve into, I think it was chapter 3 has, I think is a really important couple of pages at the end of chapter 3, and it's all about the transition zones that we talk about a lot. The larger parcels next to house scale buildings, the smaller parcels next to a big adjacent building, the parcels that are next to or on the same block as a city landmark. So I don't think we have time to go into a big discussion about this today, but think about, are these situations, have we addressed them appropriately? Are there other ones we haven't thought about that should be included? So, I gave you a little more time with this document, so we'd really like your input on these particular questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I think I will
Rosie,
oh, yes.
Rosie, just on that last list of things you're talking about, we didn't get to the design site question today, and we can answer it verbally today, but I think what would probably work best is we've been working on a set of slides that illustrate that pretty clearly, and we'll send you that for everybody.
Right.
And I'll unmute Sheila and let her have a public comment, and then I'll need to end the meeting, but we can, if you feel like this conversation, if you need more time or we want to have another discussion, we could talk about meeting again, perhaps in January, but let me. Okay, Sheila, I've unmuted you if you want to speak.
Thank you very much, Rosie. I just wanted to clarify my concerns. It arose from the illustrations on pages 25 and 26 for Main Street, medium and large, and neighborhood large. There are no setbacks between the buildings, and presumably the upper floors are residential. So my question is, where are people going to get presumably required natural light and air? Thank you.
Thank you. So Tony, I don't know if you want to do a quick response to that, or we'll just kind of take that into consideration. And
The latter, yeah, we're going to look into it and get back to you and with everything else. Yep.
okay, well, this has been a really good discussion. There's a lot to think about. I should mention, actually, we have another minute. If anyone else from the public wants to raise their hand, you can do it now. Otherwise, I'll close the meeting. And again, I mentioned you could take a little bit more time to review the document and get us your comments. Feel free to email me or call me if you have any questions. And we'll just look forward to gathering all these comments and really giving it some thought. And we'll at some point figure out a way to let you know how we're responding to all these comments before we move on to the next phase. Any last, I have 1 minute left, Cass. And
One
Denny?
last thing is, and we're happy to give you a list of, of get photographs. We could probably help to gather those for you all to get better examples of projects that are actually in Santa Barbara. We're happy to help with that. And we can, I'm sure all of us can work together. If there's a particularly great example of something, then, I think that would be good to let Rosie know, and then, get some images that really reflect these from Santa Barbara.
Thank you. And Denny?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to you, Rosie, for organizing these meetings and compiling all of our comments and concerns into some kind of organized form at some point. And I do want to say, I love this discussion. I think it's really, really important. And we may not agree on every point, but I want to be clear that I think the document is truly amazing. It's a beautiful document. So much amazing and important detail. And though I may be pushing for simplification, that's not a reflection on the great work that you guys have done. So
You're here.
Yes, thank you to Opticus. And yeah, you're hearing a lot from us, but we all are really happy working with it and very excited. It's just taking a lot to understand it and wanting to make it something we can call our own in our city of Santa Barbara. So. All right, well, with that, I'll adjourn the meeting and we'll be in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.